So the word just is a complicated word. On the one hand, it evokes systems of administering justice, of adjudicating right and wrong, and doling out punishments. It also points to movements against established norms, fights for new values and conceptions of the just. But it's also a lighter word. It's about throwaway things. Just kidding. Just for the hell of it. Just one of those days. It speaks of play, of looseness, of tossing rules aside. And in architecture, the obsession with the just so, the precision of line weights, of material connections, of structural systems, brings a kind of pleasure and play in an OCD sort of way, but also points to value systems inside and outside of the discipline. With the word just, we wanted to intentionally collide themes of justice, play, and precision. As is a tradition with the Architectural League Prize, a committee of recent awardees, as Anne mentioned, chooses the topic. So along with Anya Sirota of Akayoki in Detroit and Isabel Abascal of Lanza Atelier in Mexico City, we came up with this idea and had the pleasure of working with Mario, Juliet, and Paul, as was mentioned, on the selection of winners. Our aim was to explore the range of practices that address the urgencies of our moment, particularly the social, political, environmental urgencies that confront us. This can sometimes feel like a dark time, one that demands a dramatic rethinking of the aims and means of the profession. But it also requires the full arsenal of architectural skills, not only spatial intelligence and planning, but also the capacity for inventing new business models, new methods of engagement, and new forms of joy. While there have historically been divisions, if not antagonisms, between politically driven practices and those focused on form and representation, we are excited about a new generation of practitioners who are bursting out of these categories. The practices that you will see tonight and tomorrow merge design innovation and spatial engagement, social engagement. They treat the tools of the profession as embedded in socio-political contexts and deploy them with effusive and thoughtful play. They communicate faith that the field, with its obsessions and its pleasures, will have impact beyond itself. In sending out this call, we discovered an even richer array of practices than we expected. The 6 winners encompass a wide range of approaches to the theme, from those that directly address social justice through activism and collaboration with local community organizations, to those that explore how the techniques of architecture are intertwined with latent cultural values and social effects. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce 3 of the winners: Mira Hasson Henry of Henry Architecture, Jennifer Bonner of Mall, and Cyrus Penarroyo of Extense. These 3 winners in particular explore how architectural tools of representation, form-making, and materiality are entangled with larger cultural narratives and contexts. By hacking these tools and redeploying them to surprising ends, they highlight how the just so's of architecture have social agency. So to start with, Mira first, yes? Okay. Mira Hasson Henry is principal of Henry Architecture based in Los Angeles and design faculty at Southern California Institute of Architecture, or SCIARC. She also coordinates the DID Summer Outreach Program for high school students at SCIARC. Before starting her practice, Mira earned her master's in architecture at UCLA and worked at Monica Ponce de Leon's studio and Office Da. Her own practice, Henry Architecture, combines experimental and speculative projects with built work, including her recent exhibition, Rough Coat, at the SCIARC Gallery. Her work grapples with established formal and material techniques in architecture, insisting that any method is entangled in the politics of its time and place. As she describes eloquently in her portfolio statement, quote, "Formal technique, material experimentation, and representation are cross-cut and interrupted by the quotidian circumstances that surround any given project. Its context, who makes it, how it is made, and the way it is publicly consumed. In this case, formal ideation is implicitly informed by and bound up in contemporary concerns of race, gender, and desire. In order to traverse these often siloed topics, I, as in Mira, explore tactics that privilege attention to mundane details, coincidence of association, and the mildly absurd." So with that, I bring you Mira.
I framed this lecture in 2 parts. Part 1, Walking and Talking, which is a series of ambulatory reflections in which I will attempt to lay out a set of terms, tactics, and values. And part 2, Coats and Beds, I will show briefly a particular project I did this past year called Rough Coat, for the Sci Art Gallery. The title of the talk, Gentle Nudge, Cutting Look on the Tactics of Interrupting the Normal Vibe, comes from the statement I wrote for this competition. It's an attempt to get at the methods for working that allow for layered formalism on my own terms. This is one that contains both deep criticality and optimism. So I'd like to begin with a story of description that takes place up the street from where I live, at the corner of Jefferson Boulevard and Arlington in Los Angeles. For those of you that may or may not know Los Angeles, this is a spot about half a mile south of the 10 freeway in the historic neighborhood of Jefferson Park. It's primarily a working class Black and Latino neighborhood. And due to the high quality of the housing stock, however, and the rather central location in the city, it has also become a hot place for new, affluent, and mostly white buyers. In this way, the intersection is like many urban moments in Los Angeles and around the country, full of cultural overlap and transformation. The building on the right is a hulking, squarish structure, painted white with a curly crown. It's one of my favorite buildings in the city. It sits discreetly on the corner, couched within a collection of buildings that carry their own particular character in both appearance and use. There's the stout pink fourplex to the right. Its narrow front yard has been the site of many birthday party castles and graduation tents, filling the tight site even further to the brim with a colored-themed party rental supplies. There's the Burger Palace with its iconic super hat roof, an even more iconic super sign advertising a cultural pastiche of offerings, pastrami, chicken, burritos, tacos, and fresh pressed carrot juice. Just check it out. And beyond, on the other side of Arlington, is a strip mall painted yellow with red accents, as if the color palette of the Burger Palace jumped the street and inverted. Here, there's a beauty supply store, a liquor store, cell phone store, and the famous Louisiana fried chicken, Chinese food, and donuts. Bookending the complex is an extra deep Beautress building with a fancy marquee front. It's an old neighborhood theater turned pawn shop, among other things notable for the way in which the scale and eclecticism of the typography pile up and fill the frame of the facade. Crude, elegant, and confident, all in one. The building that is the object of my obsession sits between all these formal and informal layers that make up the context. It is a church, Iglesia de Jesucristo de Canaán Central. The tent on the side is the kitchen. The building is mostly a generic stucco box, flat on two sides with unremarkable openings. Here, though, we can see that they see the seam that separates the generic from the specific. Framing the large picture windows with steel mullions is a thick cast concrete ornamental layer. From the oblique view, we can see the substantial thickness of the outer cladding. With the windows blanked out by the maroon and gold cloth on the interior, any other spatial depth is denied. Instead, our voyeuristic view is left ping-ponging between the micro layers of the curb and the curtain. Let me return, though, to this idea of the curly crown. I've always thought that the ornamental cast facade gave the building a strange, near anthropomorphism. That building has curly hair, I would say to myself, much like the exclamation of a child when she identifies something familiar out in the world. The building was built in 1928. More typical of that era in LA are hand-carved facades with delicate, intricate ornamentation. In contrast, this uber filigree takes on more presence than simply a layer of confection. It's less curlicue and more curl, big, heavy, and full. Undeniably, for me, an art history undergrad student in the late 90s, to raise the subject of any curly locks, I can't not invoke Lorna Simpson and her canonical piece Wigs portfolio from 1994. For those less familiar with the piece, it's a collection of wigs that are varied and particular in style. The photographs are printed on a thick off-white felt, giving the images themselves a woolly material presence. Interspersed with the images are fictional texts that conjure meanings that range wildly from the history of slavery to drag. The near anthropomorphism, or more broadly, this idea of the figure and character of building, building form has been on my mind for some time. This slide of the drawing by 18th century French architect Jacques-François Blondel has been a part of my lecture for several years. So is this one, Godfrey Semper's 19th century iconic drawing of the Caribbean hut. But in putting this lecture together, I felt that it was important for me to address head-on the complexity I felt with working from these historical models. Blondel's etchings are clear. In true humanist fashion, he uses the facial profile as a formal defense for the proportions of a cornice detail. These are idealized, white, Western figures, of course. This is his context of beauty. There's a young man, an old man, and a maiden. The system of representation in the drawing shows an overlay of a conceptual notion and building form. Ultimately, the building is an abstraction of the human figure. The body, in this case, is a specter within the construction of an architectural idea. For Semper, 100 years later, the drawings of the Caribbean hut demonstrate his four elements of architecture: the hearth, the roof, the enclosure, and the mound. This position comes out of an anthropological and colonial form of analysis of indigenous craft and techniques, which is typical of the 19th century. The particularities of this hut, however, we know very little about. While it's called the Carib hut, it is effectively rendered an ahistorical and culturally neutralized model in service of an architectural principle. The form of representation in this case makes the specter of the human figure far easier to ignore. By this I mean the colonial body and the history of violence it represents is purged from this view. As a point of reference, Semper is working during the time of the Great Exhibition, 1851. This is an early modern moment and a height of Western imperialist power. We're also, let's not forget, hundreds of years into slavery, which incites the African diaspora that has formatively and effectively shaped culture as we know it. In this illustration, human beings from colonized nations stand side by side, new industrial artifacts and taxidermy. These are the wonders of the modern world as consumed by Western culture. I'm not producing this as new information, we know this. We also know that in the 19th century, during the formation of the modern subject, there were human zoos, famous in France, Belgium, and Germany, a practice that lasted into the mid-20th century. I think about Blondel's pure formal overlay of human figure to building, and Semper's layering system that blocks out the memory of the subject. Perhaps we can also think about these images, these ones, which show the human figure, the building, and the landscape as a collapse of many layers, and in this case of power, exotification, exploitation, and violence. And so we arrive here with Loos and his principles of cladding and his house for Josephine Baker in the 1920s. We have a building with black and white stripes and an insanely voyeuristic interior designed with a single woman in mind, a light-skinned black performer from St. Louis, that is, who traveled to Paris and captured the imagination of an entire generation. So it is by now, I hope you can begin to anticipate why I'm both attracted and repulsed by this project. It is the metaphorical Freudian slip in modern architecture. It demonstrates the wildly racialized and gendered nature of the building's skin in the context of modern architecture. This is a photo on the right is Le Corbusier and Josephine Baker at a costume ball on a cruise in 1929. It was a very famous moment for Le Corbusier. She is in whiteface, dressed as Pierrot, and he as a prisoner or jailbird in black and white stripes. And framing the image on the right is an unknown man who grins back at us in blackface. Last year, I took this picture of the building on Arlington and Jefferson Boulevard. This was before the church repainted it and put up fresh curtains. I wanted to capture this fleeting moment in which the Why Am I Jeans campaign, Want a Better Butt, was displayed in front of the curly-haired building. The image is of a woman at one-to-one scale positioned as if she's lying on the bus stop bench. The LA-based jean company developed the jeans with more room for curves for Black and Hispanic women. And the objectification of female body aside, this woman is fierce. She's amazing. She stares straight back at you and is untouchable. I think about Manet's Olympia, or perhaps Laurent, the Afro-Brazilian French immigrant that lived in Manet's building, Afro-Brazilian French immigrant that did live in Manet's building and posed for him for this painting and in many others. She's in the dark in the background. But what I like about this image, or the idea of this image, is that it both refers to and breaks that historical model. The brown female body is neither in the dark nor erased, and here in the facade, the possibility of an aesthetic project may be evident. We get a hint of how forms of abstraction may elevate her locks to the monumental scale of a building. So I return to this idea of the wig and cladding, this time thinking of Ellen Gallagher's wig drawings, which are haunting and tactile and radically confident. And Lorna Simpson's recent wigged collages that take us to a place that is color-soaked and swirled. It is one that shows us a model of how we may layer up things that are wildly beautiful, playful, and cutting. This is what I would describe as an exalted formalism. So with a lightness in my step, I turn from my spot on the corner, and I'm on the hunt to take a couple of pictures of some new houses that keep catching my eye. There's this amazing house that floors me every time I see it, all painted in light purple with dark purple trim. The dark tinted windows form bold black squares, and on either side sit puffy pom-pom bushes with new growth green that is so electric that it makes everything pop. And then there is this brooding house, all in brown, buttoned up, retreating in every way. And these two sit side by side as if colluding to see which house can be more color-saturated and vibrant. The sheer shock of color that each offer is only made more impressive by this silver foil window finish that lurks deep in the frame. I think about this notion of the specter of the subject as I admire the beauty and subtle or not so subtle swag of these homes. How, I wonder, can I share this sense of exaltation that I feel with other folks? Part 2, coats and beds. In October 2018, I installed a project called Rough Coat in the Sciarc Gallery. The project grew out of this work, the work that I've been doing walking around South LA and surveying houses. On the left is a photograph of one of the many houses I documented while looking at the material expression of privacy. Bushes, awnings, eaves, cladding, shutters, windows, window tinting, blinds, and drapery were all pushed into a narrow zone that creates a thick layer that would in all cases divide the exterior and the interior. On the right is an image of a painting by Kerry James Marshall called Nude Spotlight in 2009. It's an arresting image, one of freedom and the intimacy of the interior. It also demonstrates the way in which Marshall is a master at working, as a master, first of all, and at how to render darkness and to render skin. I describe the project Rough Coat as a facade-scaled blanket. It's a literal coming together of the softness and informality and intimacy of the interior and the structured cladding of a house that must do an entirely different type of work, namely protect and conceal. And I took cues from Marshall and chose to work in the dark, so to speak. This is the entry to the gallery. You can see the walls are all painted in near black, brown tone. The text on the door addresses the viewer. Dear visitor, this is a pretty easygoing show. Feel free to touch the blankets and lie down on the beds. The gallery was organized as an interior landscape with a large blanket draped over a frame and two large beds on either side. In this image on the left, you can see that the blanket is gaping open like a big picture window, and the two beds, one in the foreground and one in the background, produce the effect of spatial mirroring. The blanket is an 18-foot by 18-foot, 18-foot by 18-foot piece, and is designed as a panelized system that I fabricated with a group of students. The panels were developed as with an idea of scale in mind, so they were light enough for one person to pick up, but a bit too big to assemble without working together. The project is an experiment in working with two things that seem to not really go together very well: open cell upholstery foam and building grade stucco. One element clearly referring to an interior language of detailing, and the other a conventional exterior siding material. With these, our two principal substrates, we worked on layering it, coating it, sewing it, stuffing it, and tufting it. such that in the end, the legibility of the project hovered in a strange place between that which we know well and something quite alien and absurd. I was interested in the sort of mixed sensibility of the material, that it is pliable and inviting, and yet the roughness of the coat felt a little wrong and a bit uncomfortable. I invited folks for a series of closed photo sessions and documented friends and documented by a really talented friend of mine named Tia Thompson. It was really amazing, some really amazing times doing this work. During these events, we asked people to just let loose and mess around with the material. And the photos I'll show you document some of the range of playfulness and awkwardness and sometimes intimacy of these interactions. The tectonic question of how things come together and the interaction between surface and structure plays out through a notion of aesthetic empathy, this idea of empathy, in thinking about tectonics. So the blanket drapes and the structure bends and people and material are all kind of come together and take up space and let loose a little. A note on color. So when I brought the piece into the gallery, was really awful because the lights were so bright that they effectively flattened the texture. And they undermined the notion of tonal variation and gradation they were working on. So we had to do a lot of work to bring the light levels and the temperature to a place where the material even felt visible. So you can see here, the lights are turned way down, and in this case, that black-brown tone of the wall starts to kind of become green through its association, a sort of fugitive way in relationship to the piece in front. And thinking about Marshall and his paintings in the dark and the way that he renders skin, the project worked to bring out the subtle distinction in tone and texture of the blankets as well as the people in the space. So the palette was based loosely off of the idea of abstraction of skin tones and the landscape. So basically 3 colors, a brown, a green, and then a really hot yellow just to wake it all up. I want to close just with a 1-minute clip or 45-second clip of a conversation I had recorded in the space with a dear friend of mine and colleague, Victor Jones. In many ways, when I was working on this project, I was fumbling to figure out a way to disrupt the normal vibe and utter an architectural idea through my own lived experience. Victor was the first one to help point that out to me, and for that I want to thank him. Okay, I'm going to attempt to...
So there's a sort of like just die-hard resistance that I feel in working on that project of kind of the enclosure is to maybe not then extract and like pull away and try and extract, let's say, principles that are like not make it about principles, but like let's just do it. Let's just let's make it. Let's make it. Let's make it.
There's a bit of a Uma Thurman Kill Bill scenario here, which is like come out swinging and hitting at all things that have not allowed a certain visibility in the discipline or in the kind of privileging certain ways of thinking.
Yeah.
And there seems to be very much a deliberate attitude towards I need space and I want space and no one's going to give me this space, so I must claim it and take it.
Yeah.